And the idea was, it was a fantastic one. It was just it was trying to get our heads around what was this going to look like in terms of choosing 25 pieces that could be representative of something, not just in terms of looking at the past and the Good Friday Agreement as a historical document. It's all those conversations that had to take place that led up to that, and the conversations that had to take place after it, and how are we going to put this together in something that was visual and at the same time sparks a conversation, and that you bring to life these 25 pieces.
Well, Kieran brought them to life, and Marie-Therese brought them to life, and Stephen Loretta brought them to life.
Yeah, well, I think that I've worked obviously with Bram before, but obviously it was the first meeting Anthony, and working out what the remit was there was kind of very helpful, do you know what I mean? Because I knew that the pieces of Bran, obviously known Bran, I knew the pieces were going to be fantastic. But when I actually got the pieces via the photographs from Marie-Therese, it was so obvious to me that these things, by their very nature, were already designed because of their hand-drawnness or their handwritingness or the material in which they were recorded. And I thought to myself, well, I don't really need to do too much with regards to the actual design. I just need to let these pieces speak. But I also thought to myself, I wonder, could I try to create some of that energy around Bran's initial recordings of the artifacts? And therefore, I tried to make the pieces, with regards to the layout, which is chronological, but I wanted them to have a rhythm and a pace, and hopefully we've achieved that.
Oh no, I think we have, Kieran, because what we've had to do is type many of my words in a label, because I write the way a spider walks when it's drunk. Every letter and every word looks as if it's about to fall over. But I think what that also shows, and what the book and what the exhibition shows, is the haphazard nature of news. That it's not planned. It's not all choreographed. You go to these meetings, you don't get 3 days notice to meet the IRA. You might get 20 minutes notice or 15 minutes. So it's taking a few taxi receipts of a taxi driver. It's lifting a few BBC taxi vouchers.
And I think it's indicative of the technology and where we were at. It almost places it at a time. People would say now, you would put that into your notes on your smartphone or something or whatever you would. Yeah. So it very much places each piece at a time, because it's tangible, the mid-90s, but it's actually quite a long time ago. And in technology terms, it's a long, long time ago.
These pieces also show the conversations, the difficult conversations that led us up to the Good Friday Agreement, the difficult conversations that had to take place after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in terms of implementing it. And these pieces show courage, show leadership, show anguish as well, extreme anguish in terms of people taking those steps and having to think through those steps. So I'm absolutely delighted that the Centre for Cross-Border Studies was able to make this event happen, and to have Brian here to explain what these 25 pieces mean. And also very, very pleased that Mervyn is here to help us in that conversation as well. So without any further ado, I'm just going to hand over straight over to Mervyn and to Brian.
Each piece actually is intrinsically linked, I believe, to a series of moments, events, happenings, important happenings between 1992 and 2022. And in many respects, I look at them as stepping stones along that very arduous and at times tortuous path of politics, trust building, peacemaking during that period of time. Some of those steps obviously were forward, some of them were backwards, and some of them were sideways, but they basically were steps which got us all in this country which we all live in to the place that we are today. So with that in mind, I'm going to start, and we've got 25 to get through, but don't panic. We're not going to be getting through them. It's not going to be an hour for each piece. Some of them will be grouped together because they are linked at that particular time. So we're going to start chronologically in 1992, and I know something which still resonates with you today, and that was the note you took from the former late moderator of the Presbyterian Church, Dr. Jack Weir.
Yeah. So I went to see Jack in the summer of 1992. We were approaching 3,000 deaths in the conflict, and the BBC decided they would mark that across the output. And when I went to see him, he was ill. He had Parkinson's. He had typed a little note. He had gathered some of his thoughts together, and he gave me the note as I left him afterwards. But a couple of lines in that note jumped out at me. He talked about how the 3,000, most of them for most of us, had become mere statistics, in one ear and out the other. He talked about the shame that the conflict had gone on for so long, and with no end in sight, and this is the summer of 1992. And he also made the point that we're all involved, and that struck me. And so he said to me, so for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee and me 3,000 times. So I thought that was a good starting point in the exhibition and in the book. I also include, as the second item in the book, the BBC kind of technical sheet from the night the report went out. So Jack Weir's on it, Bishop Edward Daly's on it, Martin McGuinness is on it, and William Plum Smith. Those are the four names, the four people I interviewed.
The technicals, just for people who wouldn't understand, is basically what we call an aston, which is whenever the person would appear on your screen, the name would appear.
Their name would pop up.
But below
timing on
it,
it.
you knew who it was.
Yeah. But so I've included that sheet under the heading "Lost Memory," and what I mean by that is that's the memory we're losing as we wait in the present for the past to be addressed. Critical memory going.
It's the immediacy of the pieces in terms of how they're written, what they're written on. But there's also other pieces, the letters that are included, which show some of the emotion, the anguish that people were going through at that time. And I think those are really powerful pieces. The kind of the tension, the anguish, the anxiety, the bravery, the courage that some people had to show in terms of where they were trying to head.
And I think we see that in a number of the pieces from the church figures. Jack Weir back in 1992 at the time of 3,000 deaths. Robin Eames, the letter he wrote to me just after the Loyalist ceasefire announcement, explaining the dilemma, his dilemma. He's the leader of the Church of Ireland, All Ireland in Ireland. And the Loyalists want to meet him at a time when they're still killing people. And, the letter that he followed up the interview with me with talked about him consulting with the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time. But the dilemma of how do you justify a moral stance where you condemn them and yet ignore an opportunity to speak directly to them, And, I mean, I defined that mission of Eames, if you like, with the words in God's name stop. But the important thing then when we got the Centre for Cross-Border Studies involved and we thought about the design and how we would place it in the sort of event we'd create, Tim then comes along with the Creative Holywood Festival, which falls within our timescale. And, Tim, we have a lot to thank you for in terms of including this within the programme,
Well, it's entirely mutual. I mean, we happened to be having a cup of coffee, Brian and I, and just chatting about this and that, and Brian had done a couple of sessions with me in the previous 2 or 3 years, sort of in conversation pieces. So I knew the talent we had in our hands. And you just happened to mention in passing this thing was floating there was a possibility. And I said, well, look,
we hadn't
it sounds absolutely brilliant to me.
Yeah.
Can we have, can we
course.
provide a platform that might make it work?
My generation earlier on were told, well, there's never going to be a stop to the struggle until Brits out, right, basically. And suddenly you're in a process of negotiations. It's a difficult period, but...
Did you ever think you'd have been in that position when you were a little bit younger, shall we say?
Well, I'm tempted to say I understood every second of it. No, I mean, it unravels. There are new challenges. And there are new challenges for everyone in that process. It wasn't just Republicans facing those challenges.
Well, it completely threw the RUC, and the intelligence service. They were expecting a ceasefire of some weeks, at a stretch maybe 3 months. And the fact that the IRA announced a complete cessation of military operations. And in the news report, my news report from August 1994, which you'll also see in your book, we've highlighted a line in the book that, for me, the key line was that there was no line in the statement reserving the right to defensive action, and nor was there a duration set on the ceasefire. So it was over then to the loyalists how they would respond. And I can remember ringing you, 10th of October 1994. Someone had called me at home to say there'd been a big loyalist leadership delegation in to meet the prisoner leadership. And I think it had been facilitated by the Reverend Roy McGee. So as I was scampering towards the BBC, I asked you to go to Dundonald to get Roy McGee in the can. And basically, the reading between the lines of that statement, in fact, you didn't have to read between the lines. They were clearing the way for the loyalist ceasefire to be announced.
But when the Provies called a ceasefire, which surprised everybody, really, the loyalist leaders, and I wasn't a loyalist leader. I was not long out of prison, but I was called to a meeting, and the people at the top table, if you like, were saying, right, we're calling a ceasefire, and I says, I'd been in the organisation 22 years, and I said, I thought somebody made a consultant the likes of me.
There was a very intense period of internal negotiations taking place, particularly from 94 on. And Jim Gibney and I, at the time, after 94, would have, we have done hundreds of meetings with party activists. And they would all be asking questions, what's Dublin thinking about this? Or what are loyalists going to do? Or what's the position of the unions? And of course, often you don't have the answers. So you're, at the time, what you're trying to, at the time, create a framework of understanding. And it's a new dispensation for everyone, and particularly Republicans. So it was a challenge. And as I said, I think the genius of Adams is that he brought us through that.
I says, people have yet to be avenged. And the word off the top table to me was, you've had plenty of time to avenge them. And that was it. That's as far as I was concerned. They were the men making the decisions. That was it.
But you were making the point too, Anthony, that when we get to these anniversary moments, quite often it's that brilliant moment of 1998. The euphoria of 1998. I think as we walk the steps through to Good Friday and beyond it, it is an imperfect piece. It's flawed. There are many blemishes. It's always a work in progress. And I think that was kind of what connected with you as well. I mean, you were born out of the Good Friday Agreement, your Centre for Cross-Border Studies. It's a work in progress.
Well, exactly. And I think for us as a centre, it's about the pieces, and it's about connecting the pieces, because without the pieces connecting, you don't have that big picture. And sometimes it takes a bit of bravery and courage to make those pieces connect and to find out what how the other pieces fit in, and also offering, us as a piece. This is how we fit into that big picture. So it's really important to us to link those pieces together to make the thing work. We always go back in terms of a centre to the Declaration of Support that begins that Good Friday Agreement. For us, that's where the spirit of it is. It tells you what was needed in terms of getting there, but what is needed in terms of implementing the Good Friday Agreement and what follows from the Good Friday Agreement. So the stepping stones, that what is yet to come, the next 25 years, because as our chair, Peter Osborne, would often say, this is a 50-year process, and we're only halfway through it.
It's a bit frightening when you hear that, isn't it? Yeah.
I think one of the other things that, for me, makes it particularly interesting is that for each of these 25 pieces and the 2,000 odd others that are in your roof space, it's the human story that you bring with it, that didn't make the headlines, that makes it a snapshot into the backstage area, which is so fascinating. Really.
Well, you know, that's the thing. When I go through that file, and you know, it's probably 30,000 pieces, Tim, you know, and counting. But you know, it takes you back to a moment. You know, it presses a rewind button for you. You're back. You know, I talk about, you know, writing like a spider that's had too much to drink. You know, the people I'm meeting, they don't read these things to you twice or 3 times. They read it once. You know, you're meeting people from illegal organisations. That's the other thing that people, you know, don't take on board. You know, when people say to me, why would you not bring a notebook or a tape recorder? Well, if you brought a tape recorder to one of those meetings, there wouldn't be a second one. Yeah. You know, if I got stopped leaving one of those meetings, more likely if I was stopped, somebody would want to look inside a notebook. But if you've got this tucked inside your checkbook or on a taxi receipt, or, you know, I wrote it on church bulletins, I wrote it on the football fantasy page of the Daily Telegraph. At one stage, I wrote it on napkins. So that not writing it in notebooks, from my point of view, was deliberate, and it was never meant to be an archive. You know, it only became an archive when I left the BBC, and you know, all of this stuff was in the roof space, and Val asked me, you know, what's going to happen with that, you know, and if something hadn't happened with it, it could easily have ended in a skip. Sure. But the important thing for me in terms of all of this now, Tim, is that so many people with the critical memory of that period are gone, and so many other people who were involved in it didn't write it down for various reasons. I could justify having that as a journalist. Somebody in the IRA couldn't justify, you know, having that in their roof space. So, but it's also an archive that stretches across the wide frame. You know, I was talking to all sides at all times, and you know, beyond 25 pieces, I see this very much as a starting point. So I think, you know, what the agreement did was it took people into the peace arena, and in that arena they were having to address issues that they probably thought they were never going to have to address. I mean, Don will tell you, on the eve of Good Friday, you know, Sinn Féin come looking for David Irvine, and that's about trying to negotiate that prisoner release scheme down from 2 years to 1. And I think what Irvine was able to do at that stage, he had a much better pulse in terms of Trimble's position, and David Kerr's here as well. And we can speak to David about some of this a little bit later, but maybe we'll hear from Don first. But basically what Sinn Féin were hoping for at that stage was that the Loyalists, in a joint negotiation with them, would see the two governments and try to get the 2 years down to 1 year. And I think what Irvine was saying to, can we get a mic to Don, please? Yeah. Tim, I think what Irvine was saying to him, like, if you try to reduce this to a year, we're going to lose the entire agreement. Is that the gist of it, Dawn?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jerry Kelly knocked the door and said, "David, can I have a word?" You know, and the heads jumped up in our office like meerkats. What's he want? What's he want? You know, and David went out into the corridor to talk to Jerry, and he was gone for about 10, 15 minutes. When he came back in and he said they want to negotiate prisoner releases down to 1 year. And I just looked at him and I went, you know, because we'd already heard from Jeffrey Donaldson, who'd wanted it at 3 years actually. And David and I had went and met with Jeffrey, and he was sort of confident that it was going to be 3 years, and David said to him, no, 2, you know, we can live with 2. We can't live with 1, and we think it's unacceptable for wider society, but we also understand the difficulties that, you know, Trimble was facing within his party. So we had a discussion about that because we knew at that stage that there was wobbles within the Ulster Unionist Party, particularly from Jeffrey Donaldson and what the others in there who we had turned to baby barristers, and some of whom later walked and joined the DUP. So David was very aware of all of those difficulties, and he always thought about, you know, it's not what we want, it's what we need and what we can live with. And he was very clear that if Trimble could live with prisoner releases within 2 years, then the rest of us need to do that as well.
Dawn had mentioned about
the prisoner releases stuff on Good Friday as well. I think what I would observe about that is prisoner releases were never talked about in the Ulster Unionist talks team. It was never mentioned right up until literally the penultimate day of the talks, the Thursday before Good Friday. Now, I don't know whether David Trimble or some of the other guys had some inkling it was coming. They may have had, but it was never, ever talked about with me or on a comms side of things or with the other guys. So when it actually crept up on us, Brian, right at the death, it was a massive shock to the system. And I think our bottom line was 5 years with strings attached, conditions. And of course, my abiding regret about the agreement, because decommissioning then poisoned the thing after 1998, was that the governments weren't firmer on Good Friday and insisting on decommissioning being linked to prisoner releases. And that ultimately, I think, was the biggest structural weakness in the deal.
It was probably the most difficult reporting period in my career because I knew it was doing damage to the peace process. And there's that kind of tug of war between your citizenship and your job. You know, it wasn't my job to blow trumpets for the peace process. But so the IRA issued that statement, and then within a few weeks, by the start of February, this other statement, which I've written on a couple of Hollywood taxi receipts. So when it became clear they weren't going to decommission weapons, Peter Mandelson accused them of betrayal. And this was the IRA saying that they'd given no understanding or undertaking to anyone at any time on any aspect of decommissioning. And it's within a matter of days of that the first Stormont falls.
The problem was we were starting to look silly. And you, Brian, are an outstanding journalist, a proper journalist. The problem was you were a complete pain because we were telling our people this was serious, and Brian was coming out and saying, no, the Republicans are not going to do anything. I've spoken to them and they're not doing anything. So you were causing complete chaos on our message to the people we were trying to get over the line. So it was an interesting time and a difficult time.
You wouldn't hand that mic just to Joanne Murphy, who's sitting behind you there, would you? I think the person who probably deserves most credit, Mervyn, for how this process developed, was once Adams asked Hume to speak, Hume had the leadership and the vision to realise that negotiation and peace is about much more than condemnation. And I think when you were asking earlier about the leadership of 98 and the leadership we have today, they're two very different things, Joanne, I suppose, is what I'm going to ask you.
Well, of course, absolutely. And I think, one of the most important things is to make a distinction between leaders and leadership. They're not the same thing. There's a lot of leaders who don't lead, and leadership appears in all sorts of places where there are no leaders, And I think, just as we've been reflecting upon this process, we really have to think about the origins of the process. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily talking about the period leading up to 98. I'm talking about much, much further, and the sketching out of the process really at the very beginning of the Troubles by Hume in the Irish Times. The setting out of the three sets of relationships and understanding of the three strands, all of that really early. And I think as well, when we talk about leadership very often, and I think it's really been, it's been a theme this evening, we've been talking about making a difference. We talk to students about, is your leadership mad enough? Is it making a difference? Is it actually doing something? And so many of the contributions that we've heard this evening, and so much of what you've been able to do in your exhibition, is to identify those points of impact. And that is incredibly important. And of course, the other thing that leaders do, and I think this speaks to a bit of what Tom was saying and to some of the other contributions, is that leaders frame a process, they frame a path for others. They're able to see it and they're able to lead other people down it. And that framing, I think, unfortunately, is something that we don't have a lot of at the minute, but that is what we see in real leadership. And I think that seems to be what's most important and what comes out of your documents more than anything else.
You spoke about the political bravery that people had to show 25 years ago. And so I suppose my hope is that our politicians will be as brave as that, because I think it's so much easier to stoke division to win an election. And I think in Northern Ireland, our politicians are encouraged by our structures to placate to their base and meet a short-term goal as such to try and score points against the other side. And so I think you need to have that vision and that bravery to say, no, that's not what we're going to do. What I would really like to see is a politics that isn't defined by green or orange. I don't think that our big vote will be a border poll. I think that it will be the big vote that we have that elects a First Minister who isn't unionist or nationalist, a First Minister who can actually govern on behalf of everyone across the country. And that will be the thing that I think that we should display 25 years from now, the front page, the morning after the vote of whoever that person is, and a hope and optimism for the future.
We had hoped tonight to have some young people with us from the Colin and Lisburn youth projects. Unfortunately, the weather got in the way. Mabel, I don't know whether, do you want to say a few words about the work that you're doing with those young people and what their hopes and aspirations are for the next period of time? Do you mind? I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot. Let us get a mic down to you then, if that's okay.
I think actually Eddie's probably in a better position to talk about it than I am, Barney, to be honest. But, when we're talking about young people, we've been working with them for a long piece of time now, and they don't care. They really don't care about the past. They just want to move on, and they're not interested in orange and green. They just want to get on with each other. And I think the adults, unfortunately, get in the way of some of the views of our young people. And we've had loads of examples over the years where they've created really strong friendships and bonds over the years, and great examples of working together and friendships that continue beyond those projects. But we're challenged now, going into our last round. Well, we think of peace money coming into Northern Ireland, and looking at how do we make the most of those opportunities, and really driving that through with our young people. And I think there's always been, in some respects, maybe missed opportunities where we've been throwing money at things that maybe haven't really worked particularly well. And I think this is a real opportunity to really look at the future and to do something really meaningful with this funding opportunity coming through. I'm going to hand over to Eddie. He's sitting there smirking when the microphone was handed to me, but he actually has much more experience than I have.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot more that I'll say. It is a pity that the group didn't come up. We've done a lot of work, the cross-community work in Lisburn. Our closest nationalist Republican community is the Colin area, and the work has been going on for very, very many years. Just last weekend we had a group of 18 over in Edinburgh looking at the political institutions in Scotland. This Saturday we have a living library, which we do every year, and we bring both groups together. And Mabel's right, good friendships are built. But I think the other important part about it is, the youth leaders have become solid friends as well. And they're able to bring the different generations of young ones through. And yes, there is challenges come up, and yes, there's issues that come up. But I think the friendships and the relationships that have been built over the years have helped us, move through that and help bring that next generation through. So yes, all good work, and yes, still lots of work to do. But sitting here tonight, listening to what's going on, it is remarkable what has been achieved. Even though out there on the streets now at the minute, there's a lot of challenges. The Northern Ireland Protocol, it needs sorted for everybody to move on. The anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, I didn't realise it until through the week when I was meeting with the police. It's also the anniversary of Drumcree. So there's a lot of anniversaries coming up and a lot of challenges coming up as we move forward. So hopefully the political representatives can get their act together and get us all back into government and help bring some sort of stability, back. It's been a hard couple of weeks with the attempted murder of John Cardwell and also the threats that have went out against the PSNI families. Nobody that I know wants to go back to those days. So we need to just build on the relationships that's been built and make sure that we're not dragged back anywhere near where we were. And I don't think we will be. We're strong enough to stand up and move on.
Well, that's a good message, Adrian. Yes, that's a good message.
We have this tonight. Some people from a production which is about to go on the boards shortly. It's a play about the last 4 days leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. And Charlie is the director. Charlie, I just want to ask you, where did this idea spring from? Because it's not the sort of thing that most people would say, let's make a drama, even though there's plenty of it, about the Good Friday Agreement. Where did this one come from?
That's so interesting. One thing that's struck me when you've been talking is this idea of leadership actually was where I think we started with the idea. We were in a place, this was about 5 years ago. Honestly, I hadn't even thought about the 25th anniversary coming up. What seemed important was it was talking about how leadership should work. It was talking about politics. It was talking about compromise. It was talking about listening to each other. And that wasn't what was happening. That was what, with the politicians around us. There was a sort of frustration about that. There was also a frustration about the fallout from Brexit, and this seemed that although it was a quote historical piece, it was looking at the past. It was also something that could have resonances with audiences today because it was looking at how hard won the Good Friday Agreement was, and also it reminds people that it was the beginning of something. It was the beginning of agreement. It wasn't the end, and I think that's important. But yeah, the question of leadership is something that we've been talking a lot about, and going, actually the quote that I keep coming back was from George Mitchell, and he said, what takes courage is to participate in the arena of democracy. And yeah, I find that very inspiring, and I think that story was one that felt that it needed to be told. I'll also say it's a very theatrical story as well. Owen McCafferty, who's written the piece, he's from Northern Ireland, he's from Belfast, and he says that theatre is about people in a room who can't leave. And I love that idea. When you look at this, these are all people in a room, and George Mitchell is saying we are going on Friday with or without an agreement. But also I think it has resonances beyond Northern Ireland. The piece is not called the Belfast Agreement, it's called Agreement. It's looking at the nature of participating in democracy. So yeah, that was the beginnings of it.
So they're big moments, the IRA ending the armed campaign. Within a couple of months of that, Harold Good, who's with us tonight, and Father Alec Reid witnessing the major acts of IRA decommissioning. David Irvine's death then, as we go into 2007, the UVF then ending their armed campaign, the first Paisley McGuinness executive. Then the interview with the Army GOC, Nick Parker. That was, I think Val drove me to Thiepval Barracks on the 12th of July. I remember we had to go through a couple of the marches to get there. But, picture an Army general or a general in his army boots walking on the eggshell of this place. That's what that interview was. I was calling it a war. He wanted to call it anything but a war. It was a fight, it was a mission, it was a campaign, it was rearranging furniture, it was doing all sorts of things. And
was there a relief in his voice, do you think, at that stage?
When I left the room, I think, yeah. I think he just wanted to see the back of me. He's one of these poor generals that was put up to do an interview, and generals aren't very political. No. The last army general before him to do an interview was General John Wilsey. I interviewed him about Brian Nelson, the agent, and I asked him
doing well as well.
No, well, I asked him, did the army feel shame? And certainly not ashamed was his response, and that became the headline. And when he was leaving at the end of his tour, at his going away dinner, he said there were two Brians in Northern Ireland he wished he'd never met: Brian Nelson and Brian Rowan. So I was in good company at that stage. But you know, you kind of feel sorry for these guys because they're stuck up there, you know, to do these interviews. They're not at all political, and you know, they're watching every word, and it's like a rabbit in the headlights in many senses. I mean, Hume. I mean, it's a diary page. I tweeted on the death of John Hume, just, you know, that he had a vision that others didn't have. He took the hard steps of dialogue that other people would have run a mile from. He made, I think, the ceasefires and the political agreement possible. And I just basically said, what a contribution to this place. And with Trimble, I think also, you know, what I include there is the tweet I put out in the news of his death, that he carried the heavy weights of the Good Friday Agreement. The Loyalists helped him carry those weights, and I'm talking about the Irvines and Mike Michaels and Gusty Spences of this world at that stage. So I think history will judge Hume and Trimble very well. Leaders and leadership, you know, they have both those qualities. And all of that is sadly lacking with a number of those who call themselves leaders in 2023.
The antidote to fear is trust. So let's keep encouraging each other and those we know, and particularly those who are in positions of responsibility at this moment of time, political responsibility. Let's ask them to trust each other. They're asking us to trust them. And when they begin to trust each other, we'll have more reason to trust them.